Today I'll be presenting work titled Do Soft Skills Curricula Improve Educational Outcomes? And this is evidence from a goal-setting intervention. This is joint work with Guthrie Gray-Loeb and Michael Kramer at the University of Chicago and Joost de Laat and Caroline Morsing at Utrecht University. So in the last decade, curricula in several countries, including low and middle income countries, have shifted from a focus of solely focusing on academic subjects to also trying to include soft skills within their curricula. So I've listed a couple of low and middle income countries, but for example, Kenya and Uganda in the last few years implemented a competencies-based curriculum, and self-efficacy and self-motivated learning were highlighted as the key core competencies to develop through the educational system. And even though soft skills are shown to correlate with important life outcomes, evidence on whether they can be taught within a school system is ambiguous. So when we read the literature, what we see is a pattern that studies with large positive effects on educational outcomes are typically small scale. So these are studies with a few hundred individuals in a treatment arm. And large scale studies typically find no impacts. But these are also light touch interventions with a modal intervention time of about an hour. So the best way to look at it is visually in a graph. So what I do is I scan the literature in education, psychology, as well as economics, and we put all these studies together and we pull three key variables from these studies. So what we're pulling is standardized impacts on test scores. We're pulling duration, so was it between 0 to 3 hours or more than 3 hours? What I will call light touch and not, but that's because of a bimodal distribution. And finally, we're pulling the number of individuals in a treatment arm. And this already shows what I was saying. It's that a lot of the studies with these large impacts are clustered around the y-axis, and these are with a treatment arm size of about a few hundred individuals. And the smaller scale and the larger scale studies are null results, and the blue dots would indicate that they're light touch. There are a couple of outliers that do not fit this pattern, but I'll come back to them when I reach the contribution. So what this tells us is that teaching soft skills may in fact require the intensity and repetition of a curriculum, similar to what we do for academic subjects, such as math and English. Maybe that's the way to go. So within this paper, what we'll do is we ask the question, to what extent does an intensive soft skills subject that is integrated into a standard curriculum improve educational outcomes? To do so, we will zoom in on a goal-setting curriculum, and we'll use two cluster randomized controlled trials that that analyze the impact of this curriculum to among students who are in the end of primary school. So the content of this intervention was designed by educational specialists, and what students are taught is that in 900 minutes of class time, this is 25 lessons weekly spaced across the academic year, they are taught how to identify, set, evaluate, as well as adjust their academic goals. We have 149 schools across 2 countries, and they're randomized into, schools are either randomized into the treatment group, where students within these schools receive the goal-setting class, or they're randomized into the control group, where students within these schools receive the status quo revision class. So it's important to note that our goal-setting class replaces a revision class. And what we do is we'll analyze impacts on administrative data on test scores from 2,300 students. This is on internal exams during, just after the intervention, as well as on external exams that are administered by the Ministry of Education. We collect some survey data on secondary school transition, as well as self-reported expectations and soft skills of students. And we also track implementation fidelity through business operations data on lesson completion. And what we find, so a quick preview of the findings, what we find is that the goal-setting curriculum has a null effect on test scores. This is during, just after, as well as a year post-intervention, and this is both on the internal as well as the external national end of primary exams. We rule out several alternative interpretations for a null effect, for the null effect that we find, and we rule out any concerns with the design or implementation. We rule out any concerns with data quality, so our effects are consistent across the internal exams as well as the external exams. So this tells us that test stakes nor grading strategies of teachers could explain the null effect. We also rule out that there are opposing subgroup effects that bunch together in zero effect on aggregate, as well as we rule out the fact that because we displaced 900 minutes of revision class, this did not simultaneously lead to a reduction in academic performance, which was subsequently compensated by the goal-setting intervention, which is why we're having, let's say, a zero. And beyond test scores, what we find is that there's no increase in self-reported soft skills and expectations. There's no impact on scholarships for the transition to secondary school. If anything, there is a very small increase in the likelihood of secondary school enrollment. And when you look at the heterogeneity, this is a marginally significant effect that is driven by male students who are at the top of the distribution. So now, what is the literature that we contribute to? So we contribute to a vast literature on the impact of soft skills curricula on educational outcomes. And of course, our study is not going to end this debate, but what we do is we try to provide an overview of the literature and contribute by a study that is intensive, it's year-long, and it was implemented with high quality and a large study sample, but still we did not see improvements in educational outcomes. So going back to the graph, what we have here is 39 studies that are most popularly cited in the literature. So what I do is I take each study and I look within their references to all the different studies they're citing and try to compile a graph with it. And within this, besides the pattern I already mentioned, that it's the small studies that have the large impact sizes, and the large scale studies are the ones typically with nulls. And a few studies stand out in this pattern. So the first one being the one by Allen and co-authors. So this is the study in Turkey. And what they find is that almost a 24-hour long intervention has a significant impact on test scores that are administered by the researchers. However, at the same point in time, they find no impacts on test scores on internal exams. A recent study that also came out by Sorrentini and co-authors finds exactly the opposite. So they find significant impacts on test scores graded by teachers, but no effects on end of primary exams. The same with the two studies at the end with the very large sample size. So this is the study by Hamory et al. In France, and the study by Oyutz, Leon, I'm sorry if I mispronounce it, in Argentina. So these two are mindset interventions with very large sample sizes. However, still, and find very similar impacts. However, they differ vastly on the duration of their intervention. So what this tells us is that it's not super clear for a policymaker that why should they be investing in soft skills education within their curriculum? Does it have an impact for all students? And how do we, in fact, teach these skills? Our second contribution is really modest, and this is to the role of goal setting and expectation formation and the investment in effort. So models of goal setting in economics will look at goals as reference points, and towards which individuals can exert effort, and as long as the cost of effort is lower than the psychological cost of failing to meet the goal, individuals should be motivated towards achieving their goals. And there's recent empirical evidence in firms, in job seekers' beliefs, as well as in college students, so we make a very modest contribution for adolescents in the context of education, and what we show is that teaching students how to set goals does not seem to change their expectations, nor translate into changed outcomes. So the students, as I mentioned, during about 900 minutes of in-school weekly instruction, they're taught how to identify future outcomes. They're taught how to break them down into SMART goals and how to evaluate progress and adjust these goals. So this content was designed by educational specialists that comprised of teachers, pedagogists, as well as psychologists, and this material was sent to experts to gather feedback and comments. So what we have in terms of tools is we have a hard copy of a workbook that's given to students. So, for example, this is lesson 1. So they're getting a reading passage and they're learning how to set goals. And then in the same lesson, they will have at the end of the lesson a scaffolding on how they should be setting their short-term goals. And what goes along with this is a scripted teacher guide that guides the lesson for the teachers. And it's through the scripted teacher guide that we can track intervention implementation. And this is administered to students in the final years of primary school. They're in grade 7, so this is the final year in Uganda, but the penultimate year in Kenya. And they're age 11 at the start of the intervention, so at baseline. And the intervention was implemented in low-cost private schools by our implementation partner, New Globe. And they run a structured pedagogy model, and it was within these schools. And lesson completion was consistent and high throughout the intervention, throughout the 25 lessons at 80%, and only less than 10% of schools completed less than 50% of the curriculum. So the research design is a simple RCT with a cluster randomized control trial. We're allocating schools to either the goal-setting curriculum or the control schools carry on with the revision class. The total hours that a student spends in school does not change, and all schools comply with the randomization status. So I already mentioned the data, but the data comes from administrative data on test scores. And this is during the intervention, just after, as well as on the national end of primary exams. So for Uganda, this is just after the intervention. And for Kenya, which is our bigger sample, this is 1 year post-intervention. And we have survey data that is from schools by teachers as well as managers on secondary school enrollment as well as scholarships. And we also have survey data from students on self-reported expectations and soft skills such as patience, grit, and planning. We're balanced. Lesson completion is not differential. We have a high follow-up rate between treatment arms, so it's not differential. So we have 85% for test scores and about 75% for secondary school outcomes. So onto the results, and since this is a null paper, they're not very surprising. So what I'm going to show you on a graph is the impact size on the y-axis, and then for each of the exams. So the term 2 is during, term 3 is just after, and these are the internal exams as well as on the national exams. So I'm plotting the point estimate 3 times. With different confidence intervals. So the first thing to already take away is that the point estimates are quite close to 0. They fluctuate around the 0 bar, so we don't have any indication of like a fade out or effects emerging over time. We're able to rule out with 95% confidence any impact sizes that are above 0.135 of a standard deviation, which would be seen as about a moderate impact size in the education literature. And if we look at the 90% confidence interval, what we also see is that we're still nowhere close to rejecting the null hypothesis. Now, what I need to do is I need to convince you that this is a true null result. So the first point we take up is, was this intervention well designed? Was it intensive, and was it implemented properly? So to the best of our knowledge, it was well designed, because we did spend a lot of time and with educational specialists to design this program. It was intensive, so it does replace 900 minutes of instruction, and within the studies that I showed you, there are only 4 other studies who have in-school time to deliver soft skill intervention that is more than ours. And we also see that the completion rate is quite high, so this is between the treatment and control group. So it's the red bars, and they're also not differential between each other. So it passes the KS test, as well as the means are not different. Then, what about the quality of the test score data? So to the best of our abilities, we're able to say that the quality of the test score data is high. The scores also come from 2 different kinds of assessments, and we have consistent patterns on both. So, for example, in the studies I mentioned, the Allen and co-author study, as well as the Sorrentini study, they gave indications that the type of assessment can matter for the fact that whether you find impacts or not. But for us, we're able to rule out that the stakes of the test or certain grading strategies that are employed by teachers might be causing certain impacts. Finally, we find null effects for various subsamples. So this is a split by gender, and what we see again is the effects varying around 0. Of course, we're starting to split samples, so power starts becoming a bit of an issue. Then this is also a median split by baseline scores. And again, we don't see any impacts. We also do split. We also do split by each test score. So for each subject, students sit five subject exams, and we also check impacts for Kenya versus Uganda, and we still have 0 results. The final one is, does the displaced revision time lead to negative impacts on learning outcomes, which the goal-setting intervention maybe must be compensating for? So in Kenya, we use a design feature in our intervention that we only substituted for English revision class. And what we see is that on English, which was the revision class that was replaced for 900 minutes, we see no negative impacts. So this is English. And right now I'm only showing you on the national exam, but in the paper we have for all the exams, and we see the same. And then finally, quickly going over the test scores, the impacts beyond test scores. So we see no increases in soft skills. If anything, we see negative point estimates. So it seems to be that kids, through the intervention, maybe learn what good planning is or what it means to be gritty, and they self-adjust their own perceptions. We also see no effects on expectations, and students in the control groups do overestimate their expected test scores, as well as the secondary school that they'll get into. If anything, what we see with the intervention is that there is a marginally significant increase in enrollment into secondary school. And if we look at the comparison mean, this is already at about 88%, so a 3% increase is really small. And this appears to be driven by boys. So boys in the control group seem to be enrolling just slightly less than females, and this catches up that gap. And they seem to be enrolling in the highest level of education in Kenya, which is national schools. Again, marginally significant. Finally, to conclude, I think I'm at time, sorry. Yeah, so to conclude, evidence on whether teaching soft skills can improve educational outcomes is ambiguous despite decades of research. An intensive and well-implemented soft skills curriculum did not improve educational outcomes, nor did they improve the soft skills themselves. Incorporating soft skills into curricula is unlikely to live up to the promise of substantial gains for all students. And however, the absence of negative impact suggests that the cost in terms of academic knowledge from such policy experimentation may be, in fact, quite low. Thank you.
So thanks, Anaya. I wanted to keep my comments very short, and really I focused my comments around, kind of reading your paper and seeing you had a null result, and thinking, this is very interesting from a public policy standpoint. One, we want to ensure that's correct. And I think you did a lot of that, and I just had a few suggestions for some more things you could check. But two, also because you're a PhD student and I want you to be able to publish. And sometimes that's hard with a null result, right? So just a lot of my comments are kind of around ensuring this is what we think it is. So the first comments are around ensuring, like you've estimated this really precisely estimated 0. I think I looked at your balance results just a little bit differently. It looked to me, and maybe I was misreading, so this is something, so I was reading a kind of recently completely reworked draft, I think, so I might have missed some things, but I saw some what looked like a bunch of statistically significant differences for Kenya when I was looking at the balance tables, so I was kind of curious, and again, I might be misreading things, so please let me know if I am, but kind of thinking about checking that and controlling for those things, some of the baseline differences. And then as far as attrition, so you did have, you didn't have imbalanced attrition across groups, you had fairly high tracking rates. I was kind of curious, just thinking about those movers though, right? Because I think you said you tracked 83% or 87% of the sample. But that kind of surprised me because this is less than 1 year within a population of like private school students. I didn't expect them within that short period of time to be quite as mobile. So just thinking about the care, so I guess this comment is really more, are you really estimating average treatment effects and kind of external validity of the project? Who are those ones that you didn't find, and can you tell us anything about them? I think, so the other comments, again, just kind of thinking about external validity, because this was implemented at private schools. You did talk a bit in the paper about how like the means look fairly similar when you compare to kind of a broader Kenyan population, but the distribution is quite different, right? The people at the tables, or at the tails, it's more compressed. So just kind of following up on things like that to really understand what, again, it's not that I'm doubting your results, but just trying to, like, what can we take away and say, this is internally valid, but what else can we say to a broader population? And is this something really useful in all contexts or just in certain contexts? And then the second part of those comments is, if this is 0, which it seems like it is, how can we explain that? So first, I think it would be nice if you could talk a little bit more about what the goals were the children were setting in here. Because it wasn't clear to me if it was just education goals. I know, so I work with Ethiopian adolescents, and a lot of time we talk about their aspirations, and sometimes it's, an 8-year-old who says something like, I want to be a doctor, but then you talk to them about, what is it? So, okay, you want to be a doctor. Like, what do you need to study? What are the levels of education you need to go to? Like, how much time does that take? And they have zero idea. So I know these are older students. I know you use that SMART framework, which is like measurable, actionable, all that kind of stuff. But I think maybe just a little bit more, this is almost qualitative, like understanding what were their goals. Were they academic goals related to increasing their test scores? Did they have to be? Was that what the program focused on? Or could it be, kind of a wider range of goals? The other thing I was thinking about is just, and this is again kind of specific to the goals they were setting, what kind of barriers do they face? Again, because my experience with working with Kenyan and Ethiopian adolescents, sometimes their goals are very, very lofty, and a lot of the circumstances they face are going to make it difficult, right, to reach those things. So again, just understanding the goals they set versus the barriers they face to achieve them. And I might be completely off base here, and maybe they were just, we're going to do better on X test, and so you're surprised when you don't see them do better on X test. But if they're beyond that, that could be an issue. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, so just looking at your results on those soft skills, so you mentioned planning and grit. I thought that was really interesting, actually, kind of negative estimated impacts. And I know you said it was most likely they were they had kind of more information about what that meant, and so they were kind of downward assessing their, or maybe potentially being more realistic in their kind of understanding of things. But another way to interpret that would be something like discouragement, right? So So I guess these are all just kind of things to think about as you process this and write it up for, other policymakers.
Should I respond to some of the comments quickly? Or I think I'll get questions then, and I'll talk to Joan. Yes, please.
Thank you. Do you find any observable changes in behavior other than just, look at exam results. Is there anything else that's happening outside of school, later in life? I know you don't follow them that far, but is there any indication, any observation where the soft skills matter outside of the classroom?
Yeah, so the kind of data we have and the survey data that we collected was a very brief self-assessment from students, and that's where the soft skills impacts are coming from. So we can only tell that there were no effects on a battery of grit questions, a battery of planning and patience questions. But beyond the classroom, we do not know. And also, given that we do have null results, it's hard to justify kind of what would make us want to go back and re-administer a survey and invest in beyond the classroom. Because there very well could be impacts, but we don't see any indications of movement within the classroom to kind of justify a large-scale data collection to continue that. But yeah, I would have loved to do that, for sure. Yeah, any other questions? Yes, please.
Thanks. As often, it's always a hard sell when it's a null impact, right? So I just wanted to understand the diagnostic process that led to the identification of the soft skill curricula. Like, it is a private, you're working with private schools, right? You have a range of soft skills that you can in principle offer. How did you choose the training? How is the selection of the training program developed? Because, for example, if you consider public schools and private schools, the family from which the students come is entirely different. Social status is very different. And exposure to various forms of skills is also going to be very different. This does not necessarily speak to external validity, but maybe to what extent, this can be related with the content development is something I would be curious to understand.
Yeah, so this came about because our partner organization was very interested in non-academic ways to motivate students to, at a critical juncture, which they are, right? They're transitioning to secondary school, as well as their performance on the primary leaving exam. So based on that, there were a couple of competing studies that came out around the same time, one of them being the Allen study, the study by Islam. And what we kind of did is we scoped the literature with the partner, and goal setting seemed to be the way to go about motivation, right? But looking at the studies being light touch, we thought that if anything, if we do want to see impacts, what we need to do is we need it to be consistent, and we need it to be repetitive. So we want students, to first all start at the same level where they learn the vocabulary and what they need to do. They have time within class to set these goals, taking into consideration that indeed there may be a distribution of baseline soft skills that students might already have. And through that, the content or this workbook was developed. Yep. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joan Hamory. I'm from University of Oklahoma. And the work I'm going to be presenting today is some studies among Ethiopian adolescent youth. And I have multiple co-authors, Serra, Shiny Das, Nicola Jones, Tasu Waldahana, who's here today, and Workney Yadet. So first I just wanted to quickly mention, because I know there are a lot of PhD students at this conference and hopefully a good number of you in the room, because the data from this project that I work on, we make it publicly available. It's fairly new. We want people to use it, so I just wanted to throw in a quick plug for that. The larger project that this data comes from is called the Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence Project. This is a 10-year mixed methods longitudinal research project. So we've been working in 6 different countries, low and middle income countries, 2 in Africa, 2 in South Asia, 2 in the Middle East since 2015. This is a project funded by UK Aid and is currently the largest global study on adolescence. So our total sample is 20,000 adolescents across all 6 countries. And our data is publicly available. So if you have any interest in using it, you can Google it and find it on UK Data Archive, or please shoot me an email. I'd love to help you access this data. But the goal of the GAGE project is really trying to generate evidence on the challenges faced by adolescents in low and middle income countries, and also what works. So several of the countries have impact evaluations embedded in them, to understand what works to improve the well-being of adolescents and hopefully in their future as well. So I'm going to be focusing on the Ethiopia arm of this study. In Ethiopia, GAGE is currently following 10,000 adolescents in 3 different regions and a few urban areas, and then has additionally layered on impact evaluations. So I'm going to talk to you about one of those today. So for those of you who your research isn't focused on adolescence, so why do we care so much about adolescence? So by adolescence, I mean the second decade of life, right, ages 10 to 19. This has been recognized as a critical period for human development, second to that first 1,000 days of life, because it's a time of rapid physical, cognitive processing and all kinds of changes. And so, this is believed to be a time where interventions, good interventions or effective interventions, can have an impact not only for adolescent current well-being, but their longer-term well-being when they become adults, and also potentially for their children in the future, so intergenerational impacts. So what we focus on is adolescent safe spaces programming. So this is something very, very topical. These programs have become more and more common in low and middle income countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And I don't want to spend too much time on the literature review just so I can spend more time on the results. But as there have been this expanding number of programs focusing on adolescent safe spaces, so adolescent groups, usually with some kind of curriculum like weekly meetings, there have been an increasing number recently of impact evaluations related to these clubs, particularly girls' clubs in sub-Saharan Africa. So I list just a few here. But evidence so far is, my read of the evidence is it's pretty mixed. So I'm just going to go to kind of some of the limitations as we see them of the current research, and then how we're going to build on that. So current limitations, a lot of the current studies focus on older adolescents, right? So maybe ages 15 and above, or very wide age ranges. And as we know, like adolescent girls who are 10 or 13 have very different needs in terms of knowledge and products and skills than adolescent girls who are 19. Also, a lot of the programs that have been studied so far have fairly low take-up, so that's one of the things we're going to try to address. The longest follow-up, I'll say to my knowledge right now, is 4 years post-intervention. So GAGE, I'm going to show you 4-year results today. We have another data collection round starting this fall, which will give us another 2 years. And then one of the major things we see as a limitation with existing work is it's really focused on girls' clubs only. So working with girls, but not embedded in the broader context that girls live in, right? So with their male peers and siblings, with their communities, their families, and so on. So we are going to try to add some experimental evidence to look at value added of working with different groups. So as a result, Gage partnered with the NGO Pathfinder International and this broader consortium of NGOs and researchers and governments called the Act With Her Consortium to try to fill these evidence gaps. So this is a nice pairing of implementers and researchers and government to design a multi-arm cluster randomized controlled trial with a long-run follow-up. We're going to focus, so what I'm going to present to you today is on young adolescents, very young adolescents, so that's ages 10 to 12 initially. We have work where actually the programming finished, and we're just working on the results right now of working with older adolescents, studying longer interventions, more than a year, kind of over a broader range of ages. So we'll have that, so stay tuned, I'll say. In the next few months, we'll have results on that. And then the other key thing is we're going to be evaluating multi-level programming, so girls, boys and parents, communities, and things like that, following Gage's worked on this simple conceptual framework. So I don't want to spend too much time on this figure. So I'll say I have beautiful figures because I work with an NGO and big institutions, and we do a lot of policy work. But really, I want you to focus on, so the center graphic, so this kind of shows an adolescent girl in the middle, right? And that adolescent girl, so first, she has different needs throughout adolescence, so starting at age 10 and moving through 19, but then also just recognizing that she's embedded in these broader contexts, not just living in a bubble herself. So ideally, any programming that was done would address the fact that she has different needs over her life cycle over her time in adolescence and beyond. And there are these different groups that act within her life that might also need to be interacted with if we want like kind of sustainable change. Along the top, you'll see a set of 6 capability areas. So Gage kind of took the work to heart of Amartya Sen, from the mid-'80s, his capabilities approach, and then kind of later, more recent reworking by Naila Kabir and Marta Nussbaum, taking Amartya Sen's idea of capabilities and thinking through different implications for different genders and so on. So in Gage, we're going to focus on looking at 6 different sets of outcomes. One's related to education and learning, health, nutrition, and sexual reproductive health, bodily integrity or freedom from violence, psychosocial well-being, voice and agency, and lastly, economic empowerment. Okay, so what do we contribute to the evidence? So again, I've kind of already mentioned this. So our evaluation of Act With Her, this is the name of the programming, is going to be the first experimental evaluation that we're aware of that's going to be able to assess is programming for very young adolescents effective in improving both short-term well-being and then a few kind of medium and long-term measures as well? Is there added value to working not just with the girls, but also with boys and parents, having some kind of community participation and some adolescent-focused system strengthening? We also add an arm, because this is so popular right now, understanding asset transfers for girls and whether that has any added value. We're going to be powered to assess regional effects within Ethiopia. So if any of you work in Ethiopia, you know the heterogeneity across regions is just huge. It's almost akin to working in completely different countries. So we're going to be able to say things about working in multiple contexts. And then, of course, as I mentioned, soon, within the next few months, we'll be able to answer even more questions related to programming, like kind of continuing this programming on with older adolescents and things like that. And this is all pre-registered, what I'm going to present today. So quick preview of the findings. So our evidence suggests, and this is just a really broad take on it, so we find that working with girls alone, which is what a lot of programs currently do, without including male peers, caregivers, and or some kind of community engagement, is really not enough to improve girl outcomes. We don't see much impact of that at all. And while we do see that, so it's going to differ a little bit, the exact results we find across the 2 very different contexts that we look at, We find that multi-level programs can have an impact, but they're not a magic bullet, right? And when you implement them, you need to think very carefully about the context you're working in, targeting, how to bring in more marginalized adolescents and things like that, program design, and connection to other platforms in order to maximize impacts. So I'll say the paper that's available online right now, so I'm working on a shorter version that's going to be like targeted at an econ journal. The version that's up right now is a very rich mixed methods paper that uses both quantitative and qualitative data. So, it provides a really nice, it's lengthy, but it provides a really nice rich picture of our findings in Ethiopia so far. Okay, so on to the specifics of our research design. So we're working in 2 different regions in Ethiopia. We chose 2 of the most populous regions, Amhara and Oromia. We are working in 1 zone in each of those regions. These zones were selected really on 3 criteria. So 1 is, could our programming partners, CARE and Pathfinder, work there? And then we wanted to focus on more vulnerable households, so zones where food insecurity is higher, and also zones where norms related to gender, so things like child marriage, were more conservative, right? So we're working in places where the prevalence of child marriage is fairly high. I'm not going to, in the short talk, be able to really give you a rich understanding of how different these 2 regions are. So they're both marginalized, they're both largely agricultural, but a lot of the similarities and their gender norms and the way they kind of manifest in culture and beliefs and things like that are very different. I'm just going to quickly say, girls in Amhara are relatively more advantaged compared to girls in Oromia in terms of like their better education outcomes. Girls in Amhara have even better education outcomes than boys in Amhara. So that zone, like girls are relatively less disadvantaged and girls in Oromia are relatively more disadvantaged. In terms of, what we actually do, so within each of those 2 zones, we chose 5 WREDAs, so think of those as districts. Again, selected on those same criteria, vulnerability criteria and programming capacity of our partners. We chose 16 kabeles or villages within each of those WREDA. So that gives us, we have like 155 villages in our study. So the randomization I'm going to talk about, so I'll skip to that lower right-hand corner. So once we selected the kabeles we were going to be working in, we randomly allocated those to 4 treatment arms or a control group. Okay, so we have five different arms in our study, which I'll get to in a minute. And then the randomization level occurred at the community level, but of course we are interviewing individual adolescents. So in order to recruit adolescents, we did listing, door-to-door listings, and then randomly selected adolescents. So I want you to think of the results from this random sample as like representative of the areas we're working in, okay? And we have a sample of roughly 4,000 adolescents in total. So what are our treatment arms we're looking at? So as I mentioned to you, we really want to understand what is the added value of like more intensive programming and involving more elements of the girls' community in like how much does that enhance their outcomes, okay? So we're going to start by comparing what's called the Her Spaces program arm. So Her Spaces is a program that was already being implemented by the government of Ethiopia, which is really focused just on girls, right? So it's weekly curriculum-based meetings with a mentor for girls between the ages of like 11 and 13, and that happened over the course of 10 months, okay? So that's one of our treatment arms. And then the next most intensive treatment arm is we're going to move to this Act With Her, so slightly different curriculum. Act With Her curriculum is going to be focused a little bit more on recognizing gender norms, talking about them, like kind of promoting discussion about what gender norms are in their area and what opportunities for girls are and things like that. But on top of that, the real changes are not only working with girls, but working with boys. So they meet every other week for 10 months, and then parents meet 6 times over the 10-month period so that they can just understand what their adolescents are learning. And these meetings are really like, here's what your adolescents are learning in these clubs. Feel free to talk to them about it. They love to talk with you about these things. That's the Act With Her, what I'm calling Act With Her Essential. Act With Her Comprehensive is even more intensive. So all of those things, girls, boys, parents, plus adding on community work. So meetings, like kind of community meetings with key stakeholders to talk about adolescent-friendly services, challenges faced by adolescents. Again, just really trying to increase the focus on what challenges they face and what they need to thrive. And then that last arm is all of those things plus the asset transfers. So I don't need to spend too much time on the specification in this group, right? We've got a simple randomized controlled trial with 4 treatment arms. So really what we're going to do is I'm going to test the betas for each of those treatment arms against the control group. Is there any impact of that arm at all? And then I'm going to test the betas against each other to understand what's the added value of these more intensive interventions. We're going to stick with an intent to treat analysis. If you want to see TOT, it's in the paper. 3/4 of adolescents in our sample participated in the programming, so we had fairly high participation. And then just quickly, so I already told you the capability areas we're going to be looking at. We have, I'll tell you, so we're looking at these 6 capability areas, right? Education, psychosocial, bodily integrity, and so on. We've pre-specified 14 outcomes across these 6 capability areas. Several of them are indices. So we have like an index of educational participation, which combines a few education measures and so on for each of our categories. So what I'm going to show you, and because we pre-specified 14 outcomes, we also do multiple testing adjustments across those. So what I'm going to try and show you today, and I should mention one thing that's not in the paper yet, but we're working on, is creating an overall, kind of combining these things and creating an overall index of adolescent empowerment that combines all of these 6 different areas that we're interested in. So I'll skip the timeline. We did balance tests. Those looked fairly good. We did attrition and tracking. Tracking rates were quite high. We did find a little bit of evidence, especially in round 3, of differential tracking across groups. So I do need to update. I haven't done bounding yet, but that will be updated in this analysis. But overall, the levels of attrition were fairly low. So at least that's good news. Okay, so with my last few minutes, I'm going to quickly go through the results. So first, I just wanted to give you a sense by round. So this is our usual graph showing you the estimated coefficients and the 90% confidence intervals. But what I wanted to quickly do is just show you what we measure, right? So we focus on one of our outcomes is an index of knowledge. So what did the girls take away from the programming? So topics are the things that were in the Act with Her curriculum related to nutrition, puberty, legal age of marriage, finances and savings and things like that. We asked questions related to creating an index for voice and agency. So do they feel comfortable talking to their parents about stuff? Do they feel like they have any say in household decisions, especially ones related to themselves? Do they have any mobility restrictions? These are the kind of things we asked. We collected a resilience scale, understanding how resilient the girls are, a depression scale, an index of violence, and then I'm gonna speed through the other ones. So this is just to give you a flavor, like a bunch of different indices, basically, right? So if you look at these results really quickly, so let me go back to the first one. So I've split our 14 outcomes across the 2 graphs, and if you just take a quick look, you'll see most of the estimated coefficients are positive, right? They're not all statistically significantly 0, but by and large positive, right? So that's the first thing to take away. This is the 10-month impacts. Let me go, I'm going to come back to summarizing in a minute. Let me go to this is 2 to 3 year impacts. What do we see now? They're much more mixed, right? One thing I kind of skipped over because I'm running low on time is that our second follow-up round happened right after COVID and around a period there were national elections in Ethiopia and also the outbreak of internal conflict that affected one of our study sites much more than the other. So we basically saw kind of big impacts on several outcomes right as the adolescent groups were ending. The second 2 to 3 year follow-up, a lot of those disappeared, right? So that's this. And then if I skip to the longer 4-year impacts, 4-year plus, you'll see a lot of them come back on some particular margins, okay? So let me I know I'm kind of skipping through this quickly, but it's just kind of give you a flavor. Let me just focus on the summary of impacts, so you can kind of see what we had positive impacts on, what we had no impacts on across rounds. And again, what you see is we had positive impacts. So this is for the region where girls are more advantaged. We had positive impacts right away on knowledge of things that were in the curriculum, but are things like related to sexual and reproductive health and negotiation skills and things like that. Voice and agency, we had really big impacts. Economic empowerment and attitudes related to gender equality. Almost everything disappeared at that second follow-up, which was right after things were reopening from COVID. But then at our 4-year impacts, we see a lot of things reappear. But what you'll particularly notice is those 4-year impacts. They're really related to one. Oh, I know I'm out of time because I just timed myself. A lot of those impacts are all related to one treatment arm, which is the one that includes girls, boys and parents, and community. Okay, so let me take 10 seconds and show you the results for the other zone. Now you'll see a similar thing, right? We had a good amount of impacts, especially around knowledge and voice and agency. At the first round, a lot of those disappeared right after COVID, but then by the 4-year impacts, we see some things reappear. However, it's more dispersed across different treatment arms. So this is to say this is a zone where it wasn't like there was one of those treatments, that one of those intensity levels, where it just really, like, this is the one that seems to work well here. It was much more dispersed. Okay, so sorry, let me stop there since I'm a little over time.
Okay. So Prof actually did a comprehensive work, honestly, and I'm actually not much exposed to this RCT staffs here, but reading this work, honestly, I really enjoyed it. And it's particularly because I'm also interested in policy stuff that bring about, solution-bearing interventions. Yeah, so reading this work, honestly, I really enjoyed it. And, there was not much really to say about this work, but just a few things that I think maybe some clarifications on it would make it more robust to understand. Yeah, so the first one has to do with the baseline age group, which initially we said is from 10 to 13. But when it got to the evaluation, we just looked at only 11 to 13 years, meaning we left those who were 13 years when we were taking the baseline data out of, the sample. So maybe we need to look at that. Then also, when it got to the communities that were selected for the randomization, yeah, so he mentioned that 16 communities from the 10 districts. So I was expecting like 160 communities, but she ended up with 155 communities. So maybe some clarification there would be. And then also, I think it's now that I really got to know why some of the AWH plus, ones were not 6. So I think that one is okay. Then also, I was also expecting to see something of spillover effects being measured, because I know young girls, young boys into these programs, they want to discuss with their colleagues at homes. They want to discuss with their parents who perhaps may not be in the program, and this would have some community impact. So I was expecting to see something like that also. And then also, it also sounded a bit to me like the implementation, had a lot of challenges. So perhaps that is why we had to go into the intent to treat, because we know the randomization and all that may not really work well. So perhaps I was thinking that maybe we can also try doing the analysis on some disaggregated level, where we compare those who completed some modules of the program to the control group, and then see how the program fared over there. And I think when we add these ones, it would make the work more. Thank you.
Do you mind if I just address these really quickly, and then, I'm better with kind of one question at a time. So related to these, so some of these are, I didn't have time to go through them in the presentation. Some of them are a little bit more in the paper. That difference between the baseline age group and the evaluation age group, we did our baseline about a little over a year before the programming actually started, so that's kind of the gap. We recruited 10 to 12, the programming was 11 to 13, but it's all the same adolescents. And clarification on number of communities. Yeah, it's just a tiny detail. There were a few places we didn't have enough. So we got slightly below that 160. So the remaining 3, so why did we not find the results on Act With Her Plus? That was that's something we've really delved into a lot in the paper, and we're still working out. That was the arm where it had everything, right? Girls, boys, parents, and that asset transfer. That asset transfer was interesting. So it was the girls were allowed to choose. So it wasn't cash. It was a package. They could either choose schooling supplies or like personal hygiene stuff, so menstruation stuff, soap, things like that. Most girls chose the education supplies. So I think we got mixed results on that. And in some places, it was because the boys were really not happy. So the original, this Act With Her programming I talked about, so remember I mentioned the girls met weekly, the boys met every other week. There was some communities that seemed totally fine. Other communities, the boys were very upset. The girls were meeting more often than they were, and the girls got these 3 transfers of asset packages over the course of 10 months. So that might explain some of the results. We're still diving into that a little bit. So to be continued. And then the last 2 things, so we do a little bit of this level of treatment completion, like treatment on the treated. In the paper, it really only makes the results stronger. And then spillover, that's great, yes. We should look at that, we haven't yet. So that's something we're also, as we see kind of diffusion over time among the sites, that's something we should explore more. So thank you for that recommendation. Other questions? Yep.
Maybe it will be a bit unfair, but I really think that you're doing your job extremely correctly. And originally, the evidence was mixed. And by doing your job extremely correctly, an external person like me still thinks the evidence is mixed. And so there is a bit of a question of, can we abstract a bit from the original pre-registration and think about the underlying heterogeneity that makes all this treatment heterogeneous? Can we identify it? Because it seems here that there are many outcomes that vary very differently, possibly across very different girls. And I don't know if you have data to capture this underlying, but trying to understand what is the heterogeneity that is underlying all of this, those being indirect signals that there is heterogeneity, but not direct signals of what is this heterogeneity.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think you're hitting the nail right on the head there, too, because I would also come away with this as, well, the evidence is still kind of mixed, right? One thing I didn't do a good job in this short presentation is really looking at those 2 zones and explaining the complexities and the differences between those 2 zones, because I think a lot of this can be explained, and some of this is already in the working paper, some of this is to be added very soon, understanding heterogeneity at looking at like the more marginalized Kabeles versus less marginalized. That explains a lot of it, right? In more marginalized Kabeles, it looks like almost any programming works, whereas in less that kind of thing. So yes, thank you for that. I mean, that's something we're still delving into, and I think that's going to be really key in like communicating this well, and where does this work best? Where does this other thing work best? And where does this not work at all? One more.
Hi, thank you. I may have missed this, but did you, the age they are at when you're, is 18 the oldest girl that you're surveying?
No. In the study as a whole, yes. In this impact evaluation, the girls, when the programming started, were 11 to 13, so very young adolescents.
I was going to say, so things like empowerment, and so even voice and agency, are there actual decisions that they are able to make before 18? Even if it's sort of smaller decisions that we're unaware of, like chatting to her friends, or something that getting at the empowerment piece is hard, as you probably know, because agency, they're not going to have assets at that point and things like that. So any other decisions that are more kind of adolescent specific would be a useful kind of stage to get you to the final results in another 4 years when you go and follow up again. But thanks.
Exactly, yeah. So our survey kind of aged with the adolescents over time, right? So when they were young, the types of agency things and decision-making we asked about was like, are you allowed to go to a friend's house? Are you allowed to, and it was really things like, do you feel comfortable talking to your parents about your education, about menstruation, right? It was things like age-appropriate things. And then as they get older, we allow for, more agency over particular things and things like that, yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so hello, everyone. I'm also in the person of John Mefful, an MPhil economics candidate from the University of Cape Coast in Ghana, and I'm actually presenting on the risk preference and child learning outcomes with a focus on Ghana. And I actually did this study with Dr. Jacob Nunu, who is the head of department, and then Dr. Raymond Kofi-Nti, who was also my supervisor. Okay, and this is going to be the outline of my presentation. Okay, so scholars have already established that education is very important, not only to nations, but to individuals as well. And it actually forms a unique capital in economic systems that fosters sustainable growth and then development. All right. However, in developing countries, household heads investing in education with the mindset of expecting something back. So Mu and Du in 2017 were saying that, so it means that household heads engage in strategic engagements when they are investing in the education of their children. That means that because of the benefits that education gives, it improves an individual's ability to be successful in the labor market. Okay, so based on the wealth that their children are going to accumulate in that season, that will serve as a future old age insurance cover for them. So because of that, the life that they live, the quality of life that they live in their old age depends on the quality of children that they have. And this quality of children they have is also dependent on the level of investment in their education, which is their human capital investment that they made. However, investment in child education has also been established as it's not risk-free. It's associated with a lot of risks. And using USA as an example, as a case study, the scholar like Palacio, please forgive me if I don't mention the name right, yeah, he revealed that the risks associated with investment in child education ranges between 5 and then 20% higher than those in risky financial assets. This gives us indication that, yes, indeed, investment in child education is very risky. And the risks that is involved stem from, one, parents lacking the ability to understand the motivation and the children's own ability to be successful in school. So there's the likelihood that the child will fail in school. Then there's also fiscal risk that is associated with the child being in school. One, engaging in school activities, poor infrastructure and road, wild animals, and then even kidnappers on the road, especially in developing countries. These are some of the activities that can even incapacitate the child and then may make the investment, go waste. However, the investment associated, it's very devastating to know that there is no proven approach to diversify the risk associated in child, education investment. That means that the track of education that the child takes, that is what will determine the kind of job he or she does. So in the future, if there's no job for such a person, or perhaps that industry is choked, then it means that unemployment is going to be on the rise. And now currently looking at the poor performance in terms of education, as well as the increasing uncertainty that's surrounding the future outcomes, typically with unemployment issues, where in developing countries, it has been found that about 80% of these countries have children between the ages of 10 and 12 who are not able to read. And then getting into sub-Saharan African countries, it becomes very, overwhelming, where over 87% of them are not able to read and write. So given this, and also the rising unemployment situation investing in child's education becomes very risky, and hence we would expect that the risk attitudes of parents would inform or will influence their decision when it has to do with investing in the education of their children. And this will affect, one, the choice of educational path that they have. So we would expect someone who is risk averse to advise his or her child to take a shorter route, and then the ones who is risk loving may advise the child to take the longer route, or perhaps difficult ones which may be profitable in the end. And also has to do with the allocation of scarce resources in the household. Parents share their time between work and then also caring for their children, and also the money that they have, they share it between fending for themselves in the household as well as paying their school fees and then educational materials. So in this case, with the uncertainties surrounding the investment, it becomes very critical for them, and their risk attitude is going to influence that. And then looking at the influence of their risk attitudes in their investment, it becomes also difficult to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal 4.2 and 4.3, where we're looking at equal and equitable education for all, irrespective of the sex. But now, if parents consider male education to be more profitable than female education, then certainly that gap that we are already seeing in the system may be difficult to, be bridged. Now, in this study, we use Ghana as a lab for this study, and it's based on two reasons. One, because of availability of data, and then two, also because Ghana mirrors this situation that is in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Because of one, it has implemented a lot of policies that is meant to improve enrollment and as well as the learning outcomes of children. And this one has also been implemented by other sub-Saharan African countries. So getting data on Ghana, we felt that this could be a very good lab for us to do this study. And typically in Ghana, the National Education Assessment Report in 2016 has shown that about 51% of children between the ages of 10 and 12 as well are not proficient in English. They are not proficient even in their own language. And then also when it gets to mathematics, their performance is very poor. And this also translates into school dropouts. Because as of 2020, the Ghana Education Fact Sheet reported that about 39% of children in primary school drop out before getting into secondary school. And when we get into the secondary school, the number increases to 53%. For those in primary school and both also in the secondary school, we see that the number is higher for male children than female children. When we get into the location dynamics, we're looking at the rural and urban, we find also that in the rural setting, it is very higher over there. So then a lot of policymakers and then researchers have been drawn to this problem, and then they are trying to find solutions to it. And the solutions that some of them proposed was financial inclusion, which was proposed by Afakwa and then Kumsin. And then there's also, because of loss of confidence in education, this one is also saying that this is what is causing the learning poverty that we are observing. And then also child labor, underdeveloped school infrastructure, distance to school. These are the stuff that have been studied in Ghana to be attributed to the learning poverty that we have observed. However, most of the studies that have examined this important link have only based on advanced countries, and in terms of African countries, they are very scanty. And then when it comes to the case of Ghana, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first of its kind. Again, existing studies have also failed to empirically test the channel through which the risk preference or risk attitude of household heads influence the learning outcomes of children. And these are some of the things that this study seeks to do. So we contribute to literature by first looking at how the risk attitudes of parents in Ghana influence the learning outcomes of children. And also, we look at it as whether risk-loving attitude or whichever of the risk preference is important have the potential to bridge the learning outcome gaps based on their gender, location, school, and then school types. For this study, we are guided by these objectives. First of all, we investigate the effects of household risk preference on child learning outcomes in the context of Ghana. Second, we explore the mediating role that expenditure of education plays as a pathway through which household risk preference influence learning outcomes. Then we examine the heterogeneity analysis of the household risk preference on child learning based on gender, that is both the child and that of the parent, look at location, and then we add a school type, which has mostly been ignored in literature. So for our data, we use the Ghana Living Standard Survey data, the current round, which is the 7th round. And then in that round, there are about 14,009 households with about 59,864 individuals. But after treating missing observations and harmonizing the data, we ended up with 5,101 children from 3,440 households for this study. So with our empirical study, to get an overview of the performance of the children in the sample, we first created an additive index, which we termed as overall learning outcome, giving 5 indicator variables that we found in the data. So the first and the second one had to do with the child's ability to read and write in English or French, the ability to read or write in Ghanaian language, that is the third and fourth, and then the 5th indicator variable is the child's ability to do simple mathematical calculation. And we situated this study in the Gary Becker's theory of human capital development, and we actually made extension to that theory by imposing the Prosperous theory to include the risk attitudes of household heads in this study. So based on this, we hypothesized that the learning outcome of a child is a function of the risk preference of the child's household head, the child's characteristics, household characteristics, locational, and then time fixed effects. So to start our analysis, we first came up with our baseline models using the ordinary least squares and then the LPM. And then we chose these ones because one of the continuous nature of the overall learning outcome, and then also the binary nature of the distinct indicator learning outcome variables. And we chose the LPM over the probit because one, it's easier and then efficient to estimate. And then two, its coefficients are also comparable to the marginal effects from the probit model. And then three, because we also suspect some threat to identification in there, we need to use an IV to solve it. So its coefficients, we can compare that one also to the two-stage least squares, estimation techniques. So for the threat to identification, we realize that there is a possible endogeneity in the relationship between the risk preference of household heads and the learning outcome of children. And it's because this risk preference is a behavioral trait, it's an inherent something, and there is the likelihood that the cognitive ability of the household head can affect his or her risk attitude. And this also has an impact on the learning outcome of the children, as Domain has already established that parents with higher cognitive abilities tend to be risk-loving, than those with lower cognitive abilities tend to be risk-averse. And the cognitive ability of a parent also has an influence on the learning outcome of the child. So based on that, we came up with an IV, which is adopted from Lou and his colleagues in 2012. We created a neighborhood risk preference and prevalence variable. And what we are saying is living in an environment where a majority of them are risk-averse or risk-loving has the potential of causing you to also exhibit one of that trait. And we did this as a cluster level so that a particular household would not have influence on that risk attitude. So we talk about it being exogenous over there. So this IV has no effect on the learning outcome of the children except through the risk attitude of household heads. And then also we test for X validity and all that, and then they were all on point. So with the channel analysis too, we adopted the Barron and Kenny approach, which is also a two-step approach to testing. So first of all, we established relationship between risk attitudes and then expenditure on child education. Then the second one, we include expenditure on child education as an extra covariate in the main model. Then for our robustness check, we develop a new measure for risk preference in there, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. And then we also develop another new measure for learning outcome, that's overall learning outcome, and then we use a different estimation technique as our robustness check. So for our empirical models, that's the first one is the baseline, then the second one is the two-stage. Yeah, so for the variable descriptions, I think I've already spoken about the distinct learning outcomes over there, which are all dummy. And this one is scored by the numerator. So there are a series of questions that the child will have to answer. And if the child is able to answer, the enumerator will have to score yes for the child or no for the child. Then when it comes to the risk level, there was an investment eliciting question that was posed to the respondents. So if a respondent chooses B, as demonstrated over here, we consider that respondent to be risk-loving, and if the respondent chooses A, then that respondent is risk-averse. That was the main measure of risk preference we used for the study. However, for the robustness check, we use another one which has to do with coin flipping. So you have the option to take an upfront money or flip a coin to get more or lose what you have. Yeah, so with a little descriptors in there with this graph to demonstrate what is happening. So first of all, we look at the distribution of risk preference by location, and then we find that in rural location, risk aversion is very high compared to urban location, and this has been attributed to poverty, as Tabetendo 2019 explained. And then also in terms of risk-loving, we find that in urban location, the risk-loving attitude is higher than that of the rural location. And then when it comes to expenditure on education, we find that risk-loving households spend more on the education of their children. And also we conducted some chi-square tests and then t-tests to validate the observed differences, and they are all significant. when it also comes to the hours that children spend in school and then on their homework, because we are looking at if in a household the parent is risk-loving, the parent should be interested in the child's performance in school, should be interested in spending more resources on the child, and all that. So we found that children in risk-loving households spend more time in school than those in risk-averse, although the test didn't validate that observation. But when it comes to the time that they spend on their homework, we find that risk-loving children spend more time on their homework than their counterparts, and the test also is significant in there. So for our baseline results, we found that risk-loving increases the overall learning outcome of children, that's their performance, more than those in risk-averse household. And comparing that of the coefficient of the LPM to that of the probit, the marginal effect from the probit model, we find that the direction of impact is the same, and the coefficients are not much different. So we are justified to go by the LPM. So we also find that, except for calculation, the probability of the child knowing how to read and write in English and Ghanaian language increases in risk-loving households. Then when we come to the IV results, we found that the magnitude of impact increased after solving the endogeneity issue in there, which is telling us that the endogeneity issue was biasing the results downwards. So we find that children in risk-loving households have better overall learning outcomes compared to those in risk-averse households, and the probability of a child knowing how to read and write in English or French and then Ghanaian language also increases. Then we come to the second objective, which is the channel. So first of all, we were able to establish the relationship between risk-loving attitude and expenditure on child education. And yes, we find that those in risk-loving households spend more on the education of their children than those in risk-averse households. And then when we got to the second stage as well, we found that, yes, indeed, the magnitude of impact after including the expenditure on child education as an extra covariate reduced the coefficient of the risk-loving variable, which gives us an indication that, yes, indeed, it is a channel through which the risk attitude of parents affects the learning outcome of children. Yeah. Then to the third objective, we did heterogeneity analysis to look at what is happening in there, and then we found out that the children from risk-loving households have better learning outcomes in terms of all of them, whether they are male or whether they are female. However, the impact is higher for females than male children. And then when we get to that of the household heads as well, we found that the impact is higher for female-headed households, risk-loving households, than those in the male-headed risk-loving households. When we also get into the location and the school types as well, we found that those in the public schools, the risk-loving increases their learning outcomes more than those in the private schools. And then when we get into the rural and urban dimensions, we found that those in the rural locations have better learning outcomes compared to those in the urban location. Then in our robustness check, to know that our results are indeed robust, with the coin flipping, we found that, yes, so the risk-loving increases the learning outcome of children, and it's also consistent with the previous one. We're using a new measure of overall learning outcome, which the PCA, that one too is also consistent with the previous one. And then using a different estimation technique, that one is also consistent with the previous one. So in all our main findings, we found that children in risk-loving households have better educational outcome compared to those from risk-averse households. Risk-loving household heads spend more on child education relative to risk-averse household heads. And then children in female-headed risk-loving households have better learning outcomes than children in male-headed risk-loving households. Then we also found that risk-loving reduces the learning poverty in rural areas, public schools, and then among female children. So in conclusion, risk preference is an important determinant of human capital development in children in Ghana as well. And also, we can infer that engaging women in decisions regarding investment in child education would improve the learning or educational outcomes of children. So for recommendation, we recommend that parents embrace risk-loving attitudes when investing in their children, and then also to try and mitigate the risks associated with education a little. Maybe knowledge on financial budgeting and planning, could help. And then diversifying their household financial portfolios could also help. And then we also want to speak to the non-profit organizations, that's the NGOs, to also try and focus their humanitarian activities in terms of human capital development programs in rural areas more, because it has the higher potential of helping and then bridging the learning poverty gap that exists between the rural and then the urban areas. And also we realize that these people will not be enough, but then PTAs and then Ghana Tertiary Education Commissions, all these institutions must come together and launch some series of programs that can induce risk-loving attitudes in parents. Yeah, and then finally, government and policymakers, I think this one will be a bigger one, but maybe if it can be done, it would help. Government and policy should make investment in child less risky by prioritizing job creation and then offering individuals who take on higher education, decent jobs, and then higher salaries. And we know this will induce risk-loving attitudes in parents. Thank you.
This is just my summary of the paper. The question is whether parents' risk preferences affect investment in children's education. This is a study done in Ghana using the GLSS latest data, and I think one of the good things is that there is data on risk preferences in this data set, and I thought it was really interesting. The methodology here is an IV, with the instrument being the risk preferences in the neighborhood and in clusters of 8 to 12, I think, households. And the main finding here is that risk-loving parents invest more in children's education. I really like the question. I think there is indeed limited work in this area of research, and so it's definitely novel work. But obviously, the most important challenge here is the identification of this causal impact of risk preferences of parents on the children. And so that's going to be something to think about a little bit more, because you can imagine that risk preferences of people in your neighborhood are going to impact investment in education through other channels rather than risk. And so we can think of other correlates with risk preferences and income generating activity and income and education. So these are all important aspects, and so I'll get more to that. But I also want to give you some suggestions on other things. You did a very good job in the presentation distinguishing between different kinds of risks that might affect the decision of parents. This was not, maybe I was reading an old version of the paper. I think this was very well discussed in the presentation. But in the paper, as I was going through, I was wondering about what kind of risk are you talking about? You talked about the risk of not finding a job, and so if that is the risk, we want to understand if the risk is higher if you are higher educated than lower educated. There is obviously the risk of not finishing school or graduating, and then there is a risk involved in traveling to school, particularly for girls. So it would be good to have that discussion in the paper and try to see if you can look at all those aspects separately, if you have something in your data that allows you to look into those. One thing that I found a little bit odd is you're looking at education choices, but your outcome is learning outcomes. So as a proxy for education choice, you're actually having performance in tests. It's unclear whether these are self-reported by children or parents, but in general, I would have expected as your variable of interest being in school. You will right now just focus on students, on kids that are in school and look at their performances, but I thought it would be better for your research question specifically to focus on whether they are in schools, and you can do the analysis by age group. Now, obviously, this is the biggest problem here, or something for you to think about a little bit more. You are presenting these results as evidence of a causal relationship using this IV with the neighborhoods. with the neighborhoods, risk preferences, but of course, there are lots of things that you highlight as well. For example, there's an urban-rural location that seems to be affecting risk preferences or correlated with risk preferences, and you can imagine that there are lots of differences in the characteristics of the parents and their neighbors, but also characteristics of the schools. So the supply side of education might be very different in urban and rural location, and that might be the reason why you see a difference. So I encourage you to really think a little bit more about the instrument itself, and I unfortunately I don't have an easy solution to this problem, and like how can you have a better identification. I was thinking, maybe you can look at the distribution within and across neighborhoods in risk preferences, or use some like external shocks that maybe is more idiosyncratic and affected risk preferences some way or another, but it's just, there's not really an easy way around this issue. It's a very, very important question, but also very difficult question to answer empirically. I have other suggestions, but I'll send you the slides, some more smaller things that you could improve, but I think this is the most important part, something to think a little bit more about. But thank you, and I think we have maybe a couple minutes for additional questions, and John, can you come here to take the questions so that they can hear you? Any
Thanks. This is extremely interesting research. Just another factor which I don't think you touched on, sorry if I missed it, which could be a factor here is family size. It seems feasible that more risk-averse parents might be more prone to having a larger number of children, given child mortality risk, and that could then lead to lower per-student educational investment. So just wondering if you were able to kind of factor that in any way. Thanks.
Yeah, and coming back on the identification, I mean, first, there is an issue of like, is there any underlying long-term variation that is not influencing everything? So if you think about underlying variation that is making one place different from another, then because people are risk-loving versus risk-averse, it would change everything. It would change investment in many things. It would change number of children. It would change many things, some of them observable that you can control from, and some of them not. So in a sense, it seems that in looking for instruments, maybe you want to find something that has been shocking one place recently or one type of people recently, rather than long term, because even if it was exogenous to some extent, it would change so many things that the outcome that you're saying could be part of risk aversion originally, but through its effect on income or other preferences, etc. So this is, I mean, I fully agree with the discussant, which is that it's pointing to the issue without like providing solutions, but it's a tough challenge. Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say something. Let's think about.
Yeah, so I'm not too sure there are like really questions, because with that of the family size, we control for household size. So that is okay. And with the issue of identification, I think, yeah, it's worth looking into. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sticking around for the last paper of the session. My name is Danila Serra from Texas A&M University. This is a joint work with Catherine Porter, which is here in the audience, but also miraculously, Elijah is in the audience, and we met here. Elijah, make yourself known. We met in person for the first time today after working on this for 6 years. And then the other co-author is Munshi Solomon, which is the link connecting us all. This is a study of role models' impact in education in Somalia. And I'm just going to give you a tiny bit of motivation, not a lot of literature review. This paper fits in the broad literature on aspirations and gender norms, and all of the growing number of papers also at this conference addressing these both issues of educational aspirations and gender norms. And these are our specific questions. I also want to apologize with our discussant. We really wanted to send you an updated draft of the paper, but we didn't manage to do that. So you'll see something in here that is not in the paper, that nobody has seen as of this is the first time we are showing these results. Let's hope these are final. So what we want to ask here is whether children's attitudes toward gender equality in education and labor force participation can be altered, can be influenced by exposure to role models. And by role models, we are thinking college students. So that's what we are doing in this study. We are exposing students in schools, and these are primary schools, grade 1 to 8, not super young children. We are exposing them to college students, male and female college students. And so we want to understand whether this has an impact on their gender attitudes, especially when they are in contact for the first time with a woman who is in college, which is kind of a rare occurrence, not something that they have experienced in their life commonly before. We also want to understand whether these exposures to role models affect their educational aspirations, in particular their aspirations to go to college eventually. We want to understand whether the gender of the role model is going to be important. And then the third bullet point is what is missing from the paper. So we have this paper that has been going on now for a few years, but we have added a round of data, and so there is a new paper coming out. And in this new paper, new version of the paper, we have some hard outcomes that are not just survey-based. They are we're looking at education outcomes, and this is what the discussant didn't have. I'm sorry. There is this emerging and growing literature on role model effects, and Kath and I have this paper, Porter and Serra, 2020. I'm going to advertise it forever. We kind of started this line of research, at least for me and for us, on the importance of female role models. And I'm now, instead of now citing about 12 to 14 papers in this literature, I'm going to cite my own review of this literature. It's a survey of the literature on role models in developing countries. And so there I do a review of this literature, and in particular I distinguish between role model interventions that are kind of education. Sometimes, they use videos or movies or TV shows to expose people to role models. And then a more limited number of studies, among which our own work exposes people to role models through in-person interaction. So this is what we are doing in this paper that is a little bit different. This is not a video, role models through video. This is actual in-person interactions with role models, but it's not mentoring, it's not targeted interaction. It's just somebody that comes to the class and talks about their experience and their story, what they're doing, and how they got where they are. We are contributing to this literature by doing this study in a very difficult country to do research on. For those of you that are doing work in Somalia, you know that it's not easy. And so this project has gone through quite a number of challenges in the implementation that I will highlight. We also contribute to the literature on gender norms and ways to improve or to change gender norms. I'm sure everybody is really aware of this study in India or in schools, so it's a very similar population in terms of age. We are also looking at kind of early teenagers in our study, and the contribution here is that what we are doing is very much soft touch intervention. It's just one visit from role models. It was very inexpensive. We only had to basically pay for the cost of these role models to go and visit the schools. It's very straightforward to implement. But also we want to underline here, before I even go into the results, that it's a soft touch intervention that might have no impact because, of course, is looking at just one small side of the problem, demand-side problems, and so you can imagine that there might be very much binding external constraints, family barriers, financial barriers that even if we change the demand side might still be there and make this kind of interventions ineffective. So this study, as I said, was done in Somalia. This is a country where literacy rates are very low. There are not really updated data that we can even refer to. One thing that I want to highlight here is that contrary to other countries where many of you are doing research, one thing about Somalia is that there are now, it's very rare also to have role models through teachers. In many countries you would have female teachers, and so you can imagine that at least if you're thinking of teachers as potential role models, that's usually a gender or a female acceptable stereotypical role. We only have 14% of teachers being women in our setting, and the female labor force participation is very low, below 20%. So let me go into this intervention. This intervention was made possible by Save the Children International, and this is where Elijah was working at the time of the intervention many years ago. Now he is a PhD student at Trinity College in Dublin. So he was there, and Munshi was there at that time. And Save the Children International was working with 46 primary schools in two Somali region in partnership with the ministry. And we basically convinced them to let us do a role model intervention in half of these schools randomly selected. And so the intervention was very straightforward. We sent 2 college students to these schools, 1 man and 1 woman. These are our role models. They visited the schools on the same day. And we identified them with the help of teachers, and all that we instructed them to do, so there was a one training day basically for their role models. They were just instructed to talk about their stories, so how they got to college, their challenges, their successes, how they overcame their barriers, what they wanted to do with their lives. Within each treatment schools, we treated 4 grades, and I'm going to show you how we did this. And within each treatment schools, we also randomly selected which grade was going to receive a man or a woman. Okay, so there are 4 grades are being treated in each school. 2 grades are visited by a man, 2 grades are visited by a woman. So there is a within school randomization. We were working with a very small number of schools, and as you will see that the number of schools actually becomes smaller and smaller as we do more follow-ups, and schools kind of disappear. We decided to use pairwise randomization, whereby we match the schools based on observable data that we receive from Save the Children, for example, school size, student-teacher ratio, and then within each pair we randomly selected the school to be treated and one to act as a control. We also had this issue we are also facing right now with the data analysis. Most of the schools are 8th grade schools, grade 1 to 8, but we did have some schools that only had 4 grades or only 5 grades, in which case we had, so I'm in red, I'm showing you, so if this was a small school with only 4 grades, we treated all grades. If the school had 5 grades, we went with grades 2, 3, 4, and 5. And in general, what we decided to do for the bigger schools is to always treat grades 2, 4, 6, and 8. This is going to be important because you will see that in a long term, what we are going to be able to do is to follow up grade 4 and grade 6 students. So 2 cohorts that were treated in all the treatment schools. You will see that now we actually have data on their graduation outcomes, and so we are following them up. So this is, I'm not sure how much you can see, but this is basically the timeline of what happened. We got the data from Save the Children. The role model visits happened in 2018, in spring 2018. And 6 months later, we were able to do our first inline survey. This was a survey of baseline grades 4 to 7. These were now grades 5 to 8. And then some time passed, and just before COVID, we were able to go back and do another survey of the graduating cohort. This was the baseline grade 6, and now in 2020 they were graduating. Now we are in an environment where it's basically once they graduate, they're gone. There is no way to trace them, and so we were like really rushing to get there before they graduated. And then we were fundraising, we were able to go back in 2022. And so here in 2022, what we were able to do is to get the grade 4 cohort. The original grade 4 now was grade 8, and we're able to get them before they disappeared, they graduated, and so we're able to survey them. Not only that, but we're also able to get their data from the exit exam, which is a standardized grade 8 exam. We're able to get this information from that for them and for the grade 6 cohort that are graduating in 2020. So we have 2 cohorts of students that have graduated by now, for which we have survey data and we have their score in a standardized exit exam. We also did a survey of teachers when we went back in 2022, and we asked, I think I have it here. Yeah, so for the teachers, we asked for the graduating, I'm highlighting what is new. The survey questions have been there for a while. But so here the novelty is that we also surveyed the teachers, and we asked for each of the students who had graduated in those 2 cohorts for which we have comprehensive data. We asked whether they are enrolled in high school, whether they are married, or whether they have children. So we have kind of for 2 cohorts, we have survey data, we have exam data, and we have outcome data on their enrollment in high school from teachers. For all of these cohorts, we have a survey, and in this survey, we had 2 important outcome variables that we wanted to understand: educational aspirations, so the highest level of education that they wanted to complete if nobody could stop them. And so we asked about high school, if they thought they were going to go to high school, and then we asked this open-ended question about highest level of education. In the paper right now that has been circulating for a while, we're only looking at college aspirations, but as we presented it, some people asked us, oh, do you know about vocational school aspirations, because maybe nobody goes to college, but maybe vocational aspirations are important. So in the results I'm showing you, you will also see vocational aspirations. Gender attitudes are repeatedly over the 3 waves measured in the same way. We have 4 questions that we are going to aggregate into an index, a standardized index. These are the questions that we ask. More encouragement in a family should be given to sons and daughters to go to school. It is more important for boys and girls to do well in school. Boys are better leaders than girls, and girls should be more concerned with becoming good wives and mothers than desiring the professional careers. These were the original questions asked in 2018 in the first follow-up, and we kept asking them going forward. One thing that I want to really highlight is that we have these 3 rounds of data collection, but the students are different. It's not a panel. It's not a panel because students have moved on, right? So the students that we surveyed in 2018, they were original grades 4 to 8. The students that we surveyed in 2020, they were the original grade 6, but we are unable to merge the data because by name. So it's kind of like we tried, even fuzzy name matching did not work out. We also do not have a roster of students from the school, so it's another big challenge in this environment. We don't have a list of students that should be in school, so we cannot really assess selection, attrition, compliance, anything like that we would normally do in any setting where we would have a roster of students and can check attendance. We don't have any of that, so it's just these are like big caveats of this study where we are doing all we can with the data we have, but we don't have a clear understanding of how many students we have in our data. Is it 80% of the sample? Is it 100%? Is it 50%? So just keep that in mind. In the paper that we have been circulating, these are the results that we had. I'm just going to go to the old results. We had a very strong impact of the female role models on gender attitudes. These were standardized across the control mean of 0. These are in standard deviation. This was the impact of female role model on boys. This is the impact of female role models on girls. We didn't really have a significant impact on college aspirations. We also see that we don't really have an impact on vocational aspirations. This was the first follow-up. This was the second follow-up when we only had the graduating cohort at that time, and this is what we have in the paper, except that we have now vocational aspirations. What you see here is that in the 2020, the impact of female role models is kind of positive is not significant, and we're thinking, oh, it's just one grade. We were in the paper, we're trying to understand if it's a power issue or if it is really like not impact over time. So just this is where the paper was, and then this is the new data. So this is, as I said, the first time that we are presenting the new data result. And so I'm just going to go straight into it. We have survey for these two cohorts. As I said, we have survey data and we have exam data and we have teachers' data based, they tell us whether they are in high school, they're married, they're children. And one thing that also happened is when we went back to collect this data, we realized that we only have very few students exposed to male role models in the grade 4 cohort. And most likely this is just by chance because, we randomized the grades exposed to male and female role models. And some schools only had grades 1 to 4 or grade 1 to 5. And just randomly it happened that the male role models were not in that grade 4. Some schools have also closed down because of COVID. So there is a confluence of things happening. But long story short, what we're going to do is just do female role models versus control and forget the male role model just because we have too few students exposed to male role models. It's too bad, but at the same time, it would have been worse if we lost female role models. So just that's the silver lining. So this is, if we're looking at this is the same variables that we had in the previous waves. And so we have the two graduating cohorts, grade 4 and grade 5 and grade 6. And so what you can see is that the coefficients are positive here, but they are nowhere significant. Their magnitude is much smaller than what we had in the first cohort as well. But again, we don't know if these are the same students. I mean, just keep this in mind. But it's, at least it's positive, but we also have a negative impact on vocational aspirations. And now these are the new outcomes, the new results. And so here we have these two cohorts that graduated, and we are looking at the impact of female role models. This is the impact on men, and this is the differential impact on women, and this is the total impact on women. This is the coefficient and the standard error in parentheses. And so what we see here is that there is some evidence that the female role models intervention had a positive impact, very large, on the exam score. These are in standard deviations on girls, not on boys, on girls. And also there seems to be an impact both on boys and on girls of the same magnitude on likelihood to be enrolled in secondary school according to the teacher. There is a negative impact on marriage and fertility for boys. It's not like the standard error is much larger for girls, so it's not significant. But so there is something going on with fertility or marriage decisions. Definitely for boys, it doesn't come up as significant for girls. So here's just a short summary. We conducted this very inexpensive small-scale role model intervention in Somalia back in 2018. This was a fragile country understudied. It was very challenging to do field working. Just because Elijah and Munshi were able to do this. It was challenging for us because we don't really have a way to measure the things that we would like to measure and to have a better understanding of the data quality. And we had this very, very promising and strong impact in the short term on gender attitudes. That was very, very promising for us. It was large, and given that this was very, very low cost, it kind of induced us to try and fundraise, to go back and do more of this data collection. We did see similar effects, but not statistically significant 2 years later. And then finally, 4 years later, we went back and we surveyed. We have two cohorts that graduated, and what we see is that while the survey measures are not significantly impacted, we do see a significant and positive impact, although this is a 10% significant level, on exam data or education outcome, what we would call education outcomes, which is enrollment in secondary school and standardized exam score at the end of grade 8. And this is, hopefully I'm on time. And again, apologies to the discussant for all this new stuff that you didn't see. But thank you.
So thank you, Danila, for the presentation. And I'm going to try, a lot of my comments were addressed within your presentation that were not clear in the paper. So sorry if I say something that is incorrect. So a quick summary of the paper is that this paper examines the effects of being exposed to different gender role models in young boys and young girls' gender attitudes and aspirations. And I think what I liked from this paper was that schools are not only randomized to getting the role model intervention or not, but within that, classrooms are also randomized to getting a visit from a male role model and a female role model. And I've seen the part of the paper that had the effects on both. So, the important thing to highlight is that the role models that they choose are very carefully done with backgrounds that are very similar to the children. And immediately after the intervention, they find that in the surveyed older grades at that time in the first wave, both boys and girls have gender equitable attitudes, and this closes pre-existing gender gaps. College aspirations for boys, they find an increase. And these effects are also sustained, from what I read, 2 years post-intervention, but they might lose statistical power. And also to add the new findings, which are super cool, that it increases exam and enrollment for girls. So my first point of discussion was I found it very hard to interpret the sustained significant effect of female role models on increasing college aspirations for boys. So I think in the paper, but maybe it was changed since then, it was written that the story for this was, if a woman can do it, I can certainly do it. But it's hard to reconcile this with the closing gap in gender equitable attitudes, because one would imagine that, especially the kind of questions you're asking is literally about can women and men do the same things? So I think one would imagine that if this is increasing for boys and it's in fact closing the gap, then why do we have gendered differences in impacts? This should occur if the boys actually think that women are worse at doing certain things than men, and then I can see how now seeing a woman who's in college can be like, if she can do it, why can't I do it? The second one is the imbalance in the second survey wave. And I wondered if that in itself could be interpreted as an unforeseen outcome of the intervention. So these are treatment schools where there are fewer girls. Students are more likely to miss school because of work. And the age is lower, so it's like the older girls, right? So could it be that inspired by the role model visit, these older girls leave school or reduce their time spent in school, especially because we know in many contexts, children spend time also doing other labor activities balanced with school. And they increase their engagement here because they're inspired by the role model visit. And some minor ones, but I think most of them are addressed. Let me just quickly go through them. Yeah, are some role model stories more inspiring than others? Because certain role models visited multiple classrooms, so I wonder if you can exploit that dimension of heterogeneity. Follow up, ignore my point because that was very clear. Given pairwise randomization and clustering, I think clustering at the pair level might be important, so I only mention this because I suffered the same in my study. And 65% of students in the control group aspire to go to college. Is this realistic, or this already seems pretty high? So I was curious to get your thoughts also on the latter. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This idea of measurement of aspiration is always, it's a problem, especially when you are measuring these aspirations through survey in a school context. So we definitely expect that to be high. Either the students are naive or they feel pressure to say yes, they want to go to college. Definitely in the latest follow-up, this has gone down. And actually one of the interesting things, the 2022 is the post-COVID survey, we see a reduction in college aspirations and an increase in vocational aspirations across the board. And it's It's unclear whether, the students have matured somehow, they now understand better the challenges. But definitely the measurement aspirations, I think this applies to all the studies. All of us are trying to measure aspirations of kids. We face this issue of, they came up a little bit earlier about, how much do they know, as Joan was saying, like when you're 8 years old or 10 years old and you're asked, maybe you think, yes, I'm going to go to college, and you haven't really faced all the actual barriers and fully understood the challenges that go into that. I'd be happy to take a couple of additional questions, if there are any. Yes?
So for your follow-up, the new findings.
Yes.
Findings, you're saying that you see stronger effects for women, but if I was looking at those coefficients, it wasn't significant for the boys, but it seemed to be of similar effect size with a small interaction. So I'm wondering if you might get more power if you combine boys and girls?
We are, it is a pool, it's a pool regression, right? So this is the impact on boys.
Yeah, but if you don't have those interaction effects, because those are pretty small, female times female role model.
Yeah.
So for the exam scores, you were saying, for women it's much stronger than for men, for the boys, but the 0.373 and the 0.389 don't look so different.
No, it's just the standard errors that are smaller for women. It's, yes. Yeah, so all of these, they seem like, if you look at all the effect sizes, I mean, even here, it's just almost identical for boys and girls. And it's just that sometimes, the standard errors is what's making a difference here, not the coefficient. I'm not sure how, this is all very new to us as well. So we're just navigating this as in meeting yesterday and trying to understand better what is happening.
Hi, I was wondering, in terms of the intervention, was there any difference between male and female role models when it came to the sort of interaction that was done? So really the content of the intervention. So they talked about the life story, but maybe...
The life stories would be different because they're talking about the real life, so they are just their personal experiences. What they're studying in college, it might also be different. So we had, I don't remember, maybe 15 or 16 role models. So they, majority were women, but they all have their independent stories. Now, we didn't record the meeting, so we don't know, we can't really tell or say anything about what they said, if maybe some were more engaging than others. We don't have any way to go into the heterogeneity and try to understand better. It would be great to have, but unfortunately, we don't have anything besides their major. Like we can, the most that we can do is try to see if there is differential in terms of the major or which major is more appealing. But even there, just we are not working with a giant sample size here.
Hi, Danila. I was wondering, do you think it's possible that sometimes kids actually stay in touch with these role models over a longer period of time, and that might also explain results, especially the persistence that you talk about?
Yeah, it is possible. It's just we're in a context though where there is not really mobile phones, or maybe they are, but I don't know. It was just so difficult for us to find this student. Impossible for us. I'm not sure. It is possible that they kept in touch, but I don't know if we could ever find that out.
So maybe just a quick follow-up. Are these colleges sort of very far away from the study sites? Or
Yeah, so this is something that we need to look into. I think there are lots of colleges all over Somalia. I just went and looked at the map. It's unclear. But we can look and see where the specific role models were going to college, because that information we do have. Mm-hmm. So we can look into that. But there are a variety, and it depends on the field. But that's something that we can look into. Wait, did you have something specific in mind with that information?
I guess that would be an interesting margin to explore the results on, in terms of why would results sort of stick on a few years later, given that this was a one-day kind of interaction. You might expect.
We don't really have any result on college aspirations, by the way, right? So we don't really have, we have impact on performance, and we have impact on high school enrollment, which, by the way, our aspirations to go to high school were pretty much, 90, at least in the first survey, I think it was 95% say that they were going to go to high school. Now, according to the teachers, it is 88% are in high school. So it's not like, it seems that they are going to high school, but we couldn't really study that in the survey because basically everybody was saying, yes, I'm going to high school. But yes, the college, we don't really have much going on for college. So you see here for the grade 4, so these are the students who graduated in 2022, their aspirations to go to college have gone down across the board, and they've been kind of replaced by aspirations to go to vocational school. And that was kind of interesting because we had, in the first 2018, I think only 17% of students said that their highest level was vocational, and now that's kind of way higher. There's one more question, and then I will let everybody go. I promise.
I'm not sure how relevant this comment is, but if you ask a teacher about where their student end up, I mean, there's clearly social desirability bias. And
we ask for each student,
yeah.
So we give them the list of all the students, and for which we had data because we collected all the exam data, and so for each one of them we asked, do you know if this student is in school or not?
But was the teacher that you asked, was he or she exposed to the treatment before?
We would not know. We would not know. But this is a different team of people. I mean, it's been a long time. It's been years, but I don't know. We cannot exclude. We don't know. There's no way for us to know. But thank you so much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the conference.